It's a great honour. It's a great honour to speak to such a distinguished audience here today, and I'd like to thank Dahi and the Institute for organising this event. The outcome of the 4-week review conference, known colloquially as the RevCon, is still being analysed and digested, and events such as this are an important part of understanding and communicating how it will impact on the disarmament and non-proliferation regime in the years ahead. The real judgment will, of course, be made at the 2015 review conference in 5 years, when we assess implementation of what was agreed last month. Some of the material in this very technical area can be intimidating. When I first came to this job in summer 2007, I was unfamiliar with much of the detail involved. So I therefore encourage you to ask any questions you might have during the Q&A session, and I'll do my best to answer them as clearly as possible. The 2010 final document has been the subject of much debate since it was agreed at the end of May. However, what is already universally acknowledged and widely welcomed is that for the first time in the history of the NPT, we now have future-oriented action plans on all 3 pillars of the treaty and on the Middle East resolution, the 1995 resolution. This is no small achievement. Before going into detail on the RevCon, given the audience that many of you are not Irish, it would be remiss not to say a few words about Ireland's prominent role in the history of the NPT. As many of you are aware, we have a long-standing and close association with it. The 40th anniversary of the treaty last March prompted President Obama to describe it as the cornerstone of the world's efforts to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. And this was a vision identified by Ireland over 50 years before the President's remarks. The treaty grew out of a need for a legal mechanism to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons during a period of immense mistrust and instability. It was this toxic atmosphere which prompted Ireland in 1958 to table the first in a series of resolutions to the UN General Assembly, calling for measures to be taken to prevent the further spread of nuclear weapons. Ireland's Minister for External Affairs, Frank Aiken, took a strong personal interest in nuclear disarmament and viewed the nuclear arms race as a serious issue which Ireland could address. He made very clear in his statements in the General Assembly that Ireland regarded restriction of the further spread of nuclear weapons as a preliminary step towards their abolition. The 1958 draft resolution was the forerunner of a number of other resolutions in subsequent years on the prevention of the wider dissemination of nuclear weapons, which became known as the Irish resolutions. A change in the US administration in 1961, when President Kennedy was elected, created the political space to make tangible progress. And the Irish resolutions presented to the General Assembly later that year, the resolution was agreed by consensus. Its adoption paved the way for negotiation of the NPT, which entered into force on the 5th of March 1970. And since then, Ireland's highest priority in the area of disarmament and non-proliferation has been support for efforts to strengthen the treaty and to ensure full respect for all of its provisions. Our achievements in that area don't end with the contribution to the evolution of the NPT. Another initiative which we were instrumental in shaping is the New Agenda Coalition, a cross-regional group, also including Brazil, Egypt, Mexico, New Zealand, South Africa and Sweden. Like the Irish resolution at the UN in the 1960s or 50s, Ireland's involvement in the NAC was politically driven, launched in Dublin in 1998 by the then Foreign Minister David Andrews. The genesis of the group can be traced to growing unease at the lack of progress on nuclear disarmament, concerns that heightened after the nuclear tests conducted by India and Pakistan in May 1998. So the NAC sought to inject some fresh thinking and momentum into multilateral consideration of the issues. The NAC sought support for key goals, including an unequivocal undertaking on the part of the nuclear weapon states to accomplish total nuclear disarmament, and specific practical steps towards this goal, including the implementation of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, negotiation of a ban on the production of fissile material for nuclear weapons, and the establishment in the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva of a subsidiary body to deal with nuclear disarmament. These suggestions found a large measure of support in the General Assembly. They were reflected in the agreed outcome of the 2000 NPT Review Conference, where the keynote decision was the 13 practical steps for nuclear disarmament. The NAC became the negotiating partner for the non-nuclear weapon states in agreeing these steps, which remain the blueprint for progress on nuclear disarmament to this day. It is with this strong disarmament pedigree that Ireland approached the 2010 Review Conference. In looking ahead from 2007 and 2008, we carefully crafted a coherent strategy to strengthen the treaty across all pillars. We developed clear policy positions in all areas involving the missions in Geneva, as Dahi has mentioned, Vienna and New York, and we undertook significant outreach and public diplomacy with government and civil society stakeholders, including a number of governments represented in the room today. 2010 was generally seen as a make or break year for the treaty as we know it. Following the failure of the last review in 2005, the treaty has faced growing threats and demands. The most obvious of these threats are the non-proliferation challenges posed by Iran and DPRK. The treaty's provisions have not been brought to bear on Iran to force it to abandon its supposed nuclear weapons program. Similarly, the DPRK's announced withdrawal in 2003 brought the inability of the member states to deal with difficult problems into sharp relief. Less obviously, but nonetheless of great concern, in the decade prior to this review conference, the treaty did not succeed in moving the 5 recognised nuclear weapon states quickly enough towards abandoning their nuclear arsenals as envisaged in the 13 practical steps from 2000. We should remember that the NPT contains the sole legally binding commitment by the nuclear weapon states to disarm their nuclear weapons. And yet 40 years after its entry into force, there are still an estimated 23,000 nuclear weapons in the hands of nuclear weapon states. In the past decade, disarmament took a backseat to non-proliferation. The post-9/11 world saw a greater focus on establishing new non-proliferation arrangements and mechanisms, such as the Proliferation Security Initiative, the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, and the measures introduced under Security Council Resolution 1540. The emphasis on non-proliferation also led the NAM, the Non-Aligned Movement, to complain that their rights to the peaceful use of nuclear energy was being constrained. While Ireland firmly believes in progress in all areas, we approach the RevCon determined to see real progress on nuclear disarmament. Perhaps the greatest challenge facing the 2010 conference was the issue of implementation of the 1995 Middle East Resolution. The NPT Review and Extension Conference in 1995 adopted the resolution, which calls for the establishment of an effectively viable Middle East zone free of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical and biological, and their delivery systems. This was negotiated by Egypt and its Arab partners in return for agreement to the indefinite extension of the NPT. However, little progress was made in the intervening years, and this inertia was a major factor in the breakdown of the 2005 NPT Review Conference. In the run-up to 2010, concrete progress was seen as a prerequisite to avoid another collapse, with the Arab League and Egypt in particular making it clear that success this year required progress on the Middle East resolution. Some months in advance of the RevCon, I was asked by the president of the conference, Ambassador Kivaktulan of the Philippines, to chair the negotiations on the issue, an offer which Ireland willingly accepted as an opportunity to further strengthen the NPT, albeit with some trepidation given the intractable positions of both sides. Another failed conference would have cast a shadow on the credibility of the NPT and called the future of the nuclear non-proliferation regime as we know it into question. As Minister Martin said at the opening of the conference in May, we do not want and cannot afford a further inconclusive review conference. While the stakes were high, the omens for success were also good. The new positive departure in US attitudes towards disarmament and non-proliferation, brought about by the Obama administration, gave much needed impetus to the NPT regime. So too did the successful conclusion of the START follow-on negotiations and the publication of the US Nuclear Posture Review. Indeed, the new trend in nuclear disarmament in recent years has seen high-level discussions on the issues, as well as useful plans for complete nuclear disarmament, including from the UN Secretary-General and the former head of the IIEA, al-Baradei. Ireland was determined not only to echo these calls, but to ensure that tangible progress was made. Our objectives were clearly drawn, and while there was no guarantee of success, we approached the conference with optimism. I'd like now to discuss the outcome of the conference, and I'll focus my remarks on what was achieved across the three pillars of the NPT: disarmament, non-proliferation and peaceful uses, and I'll then have a look at the issue of the Middle East separately. The general debate, including the statement of our own minister, who was honoured to be invited to be one of the first speakers, given our role in establishing the treaty, created a positive and forward-looking atmosphere and the space for constructive negotiations. We saw the reaffirmation of past undertakings as a necessary starting point for the conference, a view shared by a number of our like-minded partners. By the end of the first week, it was clear that the majority had come to the conference ready to do business and, despite differences, were willing to work for a successful outcome. So, together with our partners in the New Agenda Coalition, which I've already mentioned, and the Vienna Group of 10, on which we work with on non-proliferation and peaceful use issues. That's Australia, Austria, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Hungary, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway and Sweden. We submitted a number of working papers across all pillars. Our objective was to provide the chairs of the main committees and the president, who were responsible for developing text, with functional, forward-looking language that could easily be drawn on during the drafting process. And it's a great source of pride to both groups that most of the language in these papers helped to form the basis of the final document. The work of the main committees, the three main committees on the three pillars, began in earnest in the second week of the conference. The disarmament pillar was discussed under Main Committee 1 and its subsidiary body. The subsidiary bodies are responsible for developing the forward-looking plans, the action plans effectively, while the committees did the review part. The non-aligned movement called, among other things, for accelerated nuclear disarmament within a fixed time frame, work towards a nuclear weapons convention to ban all types of nuclear weapons, and multilaterally negotiated legally binding security assurances. The nuclear weapon states opposed all of these proposals. Other contentious issues included non-strategic nuclear weapons and the basing of nuclear weapons on the territory of non-nuclear weapon states. Ireland, together with the New Agenda Coalition and other like-minded partners, worked hard to retain robust language on disarmament while attempting to bridge the differences between the nuclear weapon states and the NAM. The result is a forward-looking 22-point action plan on nuclear disarmament. Although the language isn't as strong as Ireland and others would have wished, it contains important recommitments to undertakings given on nuclear disarmament and sets out concrete steps to be taken towards that goal. The action plan contains language on security assurances, nuclear testing, fissile material and other measures, including transparency. The nuclear weapon states are called upon to report by 2014 on progress made under a number of headings. In the short time since the end of the RevCon, 2 weeks, it's only 2.5 weeks ago, it has been generally accepted that the action plan is a significant step forward for the NPT regime. The action plan resulting from the negotiations in the second main committee on non-proliferation has attracted some criticism from a number of the nuclear weapon states who feel it isn't as action-oriented as the nuclear disarmament plan. If the language on non-proliferation is in reality weaker than the disarmament plan, it may reflect the belief of the great majority of NPT states that non-proliferation would be tackled more effectively through an accelerated programme of nuclear disarmament and taking these things out of circulation altogether. A major disappointment to the US and to a number of other delegations is the failure to name Iran in the final document in relation to non-compliance. The choice was ultimately very simple: to name Iran or to have a final document, given that the NPT in the NPT decisions are adopted by consensus. There is little doubt, however, that the final document does strengthen the non-proliferation pillar of the treaty. It's very supportive of the IIEA, reaffirming the agency's authority. It underscores the importance of resolving all cases of non-compliance with safeguards obligations in full conformity with the IIEA statute and member states' respective legal obligations. It has very positive references to the additional protocol, the AP. Action 28 calls on all states parties to bring APs into force as soon as possible and to implement them provisionally pending their entry into force. On export controls, it urges all states parties to ensure that their nuclear-related exports do not directly or indirectly assist the development of nuclear weapons or other explosive devices. Taken together, it can be said that the final document points up the responsibility of states parties to play their full part in ensuring that the nuclear threat doesn't become an even more menacing one. Through the Vienna Group of 10 working papers and our national interventions, Ireland also made a significant contribution to the outcome on Main Committee 3 negotiations on peaceful uses of nuclear energy. The final document reaffirms the right of all states parties to the fullest possible exchange of measures for the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. It reaffirms that preferential treatment should be given to non-nuclear weapon states parties to the treaty, taking into account the needs of developing countries in particular. On the increasingly high-profile issue of nuclear security, the final document calls upon all states parties to improve their national capabilities to stop illicit trafficking to nuclear materials throughout their territories. For the first time at a review conference, NPT states parties also address concerns over a country's withdrawal from the treaty after being found in non-compliance with its obligations. These discussions took place under the subsidiary body of Main Committee 3. And while the President's review, the backward-looking part, which was done under the President's own responsibility, while it notes that many states underscore that under international law, a withdrawing party is still responsible for violations committed prior to its withdrawal from the NPT, the fact that no language on withdrawal found its way into the forward-looking action plan is a reflection of the continuing deep divisions on this issue. Further strengthening the review process of the treaty was another contentious issue discussed under Subsidiary Body 3. Canada, supported by a number of states, including Ireland, led efforts to negotiate a restructuring of the review process to include yearly meetings and a dedicated implementation support unit. However, these proposals failed to gain consensus among delegations, and the text was inexorably whittled down to the point of irrelevance. The final document does recommend that a dedicated staff officer to support the treaty be appointed to the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, but this was relegated to the President's non-binding review part. As I've mentioned, agreement on the Middle East issue was considered the greatest challenge facing the review conference. Many delegations linked the overall success of the conference to this single issue. And as the chair of Subsidiary Body 2 on regional issues, it was my responsibility to try to broker agreement on this sensitive issue. The issues and difficulties involved in making progress towards a Middle East WMD-free zone have challenged many diplomats and academics over the past 15 years. Because of the links to the Middle East peace process, political will on this issue has also waxed and waned. It's also fair to say that while the issue has been presented by many as the Arab group led by Egypt negotiating with the nuclear weapon states, the reality was far more nuanced. In many respects, the differences between the countries in the region on how the resolution should be implemented were far wider than those between Egypt and the United States. Following a number of consultations in different capitals before the review conference, innumerable bilateral meetings at the conference itself, and 4 meetings of the subsidiary body, at the end of the 3rd week of the negotiations, I presented a draft text which I felt best represented the middle ground and offered a realistic chance of gaining consensus. This text formed the basis of negotiations in the final week, all of which were taken bilaterally with individual delegations, during which delegations from all sides brought amendments, some more difficult than others. At the end of the negotiations, I presented, on the second last day, I presented a final compromise text, which actually remained very close to the first text I'd done. And this was ultimately agreed without amendment as part of the final document. All sides moved considerably during the negotiations, and I must say that significant compromises were made by all involved. The resulting text now means that for the first time, an NPT review conference has emphasised the importance of a process leading to full implementation of the resolution. This is buttressed by concrete and substantive practical steps, including the convening of a conference in 2012 by the UN SecGen and the co-sponsors of the resolution, which are the depositories of the treaty, the US, UK and Russian Federation. And the UN SecGen and these 3 countries, in consultation with the states of the country, will convene the conference with the mandate, the implementation of the 95 resolution. A facilitator with a mandate to support implementation and assist in the convening of the conference, as well as any follow-up steps agreed, will be appointed. And a government will be designated by the same core group of people to host the 2012 conference. So while the negotiations were extremely sensitive and numerous red lines on both sides existed, the contentious issues were well defined, and the political will to make progress was generally evident throughout the 4 weeks. As many of you may know, the mention of Israel in the Middle East text was most difficult for the US to agree, particularly since Iran was not named in other parts of the document. And as anticipated, Israel, which of course is not party to the NPT, reacted negatively after the NPT final document was adopted. It was very clear to all delegations throughout the negotiations that agreement would not be possible if Israel wasn't mentioned in the document. The language on Israel was carefully crafted and based entirely on previously agreed text from the 2000 Review Conference, recalling the importance of Israel's accession to the NPT. So it was a historical reference. The US didn't break consensus over this issue, but instead President Obama and several senior US officials have made strong statements regretting the mentioning of Israel by name in the final document. Nevertheless, the US has reiterated its commitment, both publicly and privately to us, to the final document, and as a co-sponsor of the 1995 resolution, has announced that it will approach the tasks of designating a host government, appointing an individual to facilitate preparations, and convening the conference with a view to achieving the participation of all states of the region. There is no doubt that the road to implementation will be difficult, but for the first time in 15 years, we have an agreed plan of action to help us get there. In conclusion, after the years of preparation that went into the review conference and the high expectations that preceded it, the 2010 final document will inevitably never satisfy everybody's objectives to the full, including our own. What it has done, however, is re-establish the NPT as the cornerstone of the disarmament and non-proliferation regime after a decade of stagnation. With the Middle East text, it has made a significant breakthrough on a seemingly intractable issue. Disarmament, non-proliferation, and peaceful uses of nuclear energy all now have action plans on which we can build in the future. Perhaps most importantly, 2010 has set us on a new course away from the perilous territory of the last 10 years. It has ensured the survivability of the treaty to which Ireland is so attached and which has contributed so much to international peace and security for over 40 years. Thank you. Yeah.